Most people remember Cook County Hospital as the real-world shadow behind ER, but television captured only the pace. It did not show the patients turned away elsewhere, the doctors working inside failing walls, or the abandoned dining room that helped reshape trauma care across America. Built as a palace for the poor, Cook County became a place where neglect and medical progress existed side by side. This is the story of how both truths came to inhabit the same building. The first patient formally admitted to Cook County Hospital was not a prominent citizen, a wounded soldier, or one of the merchants whose fortunes were transforming Chicago. He was a Danish immigrant suffering from cholera. The surviving institutional record does not preserve his name. It tells us where he came from, what disease he carried, and that he died inside the new hospital. It also records that the infection spread among the people assigned to care for him. Cook County Hospital, therefore, began with a lesson that would follow it for the next century and a half. Opening a door to the sick was one thing. Building a system capable of protecting them and those who treated them was something else entirely. The institution had not begun as a hospital at all. Its ancestry reached back to 1835, when Cook County established a public almshouse for people who could no longer support themselves. In those years, illness and poverty were treated as parts of the same condition. A man weakened by disease, a widow without income, an injured laborer, and a person considered mentally unfit might all enter the same system of public relief. The county did not yet possess a clear boundary between medicine and custody. To be poor was to become an administrative problem, and to be sick without money was often to be placed wherever space could be found. Chicago was still a young settlement, but disease was already exposing the weakness of that arrangement. In 1836, outbreaks of scarlet fever and smallpox overwhelmed local officials. They converted a warehouse at Kinzie and State Streets into a makeshift hospital called Tippecanoe Hall. Nearly 100 people with different contagious illnesses were crowded into the same limited space. Isolation, as later generations would understand it, was barely practiced. The air inside was described in contemporary accounts as pungent and deeply unpleasant, but the odor was only the most obvious sign of the danger. Patients had been brought together under a single roof without the knowledge, sanitation, or staffing needed to keep one illness from joining another. The arrangement reflected the limits of medicine in the early 19th century, but it also revealed a political habit that would remain familiar at Cook County Hospital. Public authorities acted most decisively after a crisis had already arrived. Epidemics produced temporary wards. Overcrowding produced another lease, another conversion, another improvised room. The county accepted responsibility for the sick poor, yet repeatedly struggled to decide what that responsibility should cost. By the 1850s, improvisation was no longer enough. Chicago's population rose from roughly 29,000 to about 100,000 during the decade. Railroads and industry drew immigrants, laborers, and families into a city growing faster than its sewers, housing, and medical institutions. Those with money could summon a physician to a private home. Those without it depended on charity, religious hospitals, dispensaries, or the uncertain attention of the county. Two physicians, Georgia Merman and Joseph Ross, began pressing for a public hospital with a permanent mission. In 1858, they leased a building at 18th and Arnold Streets and entered into a contract with the county to care for indigent patients. The county initially agreed to spend $10,000 on their treatment. Within 4 years, the annual cost had tripled, not because the hospital had become extravagant, but because the number of people needing it continued to rise. B.F. Chase, formerly the warden of the poorhouse, became the hospital's first warden, a transfer that quietly showed how closely medical care remained tied to the machinery of poor relief. The first person examined, there was a German girl sent from the poorhouse with an abscessed hand. The first person admitted was the Danish immigrant with cholera. Soon afterward, a Merman performed the hospital's first recorded operation on a 53-year-old sailor whose shin bone had been damaged by chronic infection. The leg was amputated. The sailor survived. Those 3 patients formed a small catalog of the city Cook County Hospital had been created to serve: a young immigrant woman already under public custody, a foreign-born man carrying an epidemic disease, and an aging sailor whose livelihood had left him with an injury that could no longer be ignored. One returned to the historical record only through her hand, one through his death, one through the limb he lost and the life he kept. Before the hospital could establish a stable identity, the Civil War intervened. In 1862, the federal government converted the facility into a military hospital for Union casualties and renamed it Desmar's Eye and Ear Hospital. Beds intended for Chicago's poor were absorbed into a national emergency. The change was temporary, but it demonstrated that the building already occupied a useful position between public duty and medical necessity. When the war ended, Ammerman and Ross resumed their work and renewed their campaign for a larger institution dedicated both to the care of the indigent and to the clinical instruction of medical students. Those 2 purposes would define Cook County Hospital for generations. It would treat people who had little influence over the conditions of their care, while offering young physicians access to an extraordinary range of disease and injury. The arrangement could produce skill, discovery, and professional devotion. It could also place poor patients at the center of a teaching system without giving them an equal voice within it. That tension was not an accidental feature of County. It was present near the beginning. In 1866, the county hospital entered a more permanent phase, but the demand soon exceeded the building at 18th and Arnold. Physicians continued to argue that Chicago needed a proper public institution, not another temporary shelter adapted after the fact. Their campaign succeeded in 1876, when the county opened a 300-bed hospital between Harrison, Polk, Lincoln, and Wood Streets. The Gothic complex was designed with greater attention to light and ventilation. It included medical wings, a kitchen, a laundry, and a morgue, along with telegraphic links to police headquarters and the coroner's office. The hospital was becoming connected to the city's entire machinery of accident, violence, disease, and death. Cook County Hospital had finally acquired a building created for its purpose. Yet its character had been formed long before the first brick was laid. It had learned to accept the people other institutions overlooked, to expand only after its rooms were full, and to turn emergency into permanence. The city would soon outgrow this hospital as well, and the next building Cook County raised would not resemble a poorhouse, a warehouse, or an improvised military ward. It would resemble a palace. By the opening years of the 20th century, Chicago had become too large for the hospital it had built in 1876. Factories spread along the rail lines. Packing houses drew labor from across Europe. Tenements filled with families who had arrived with little money and few connections, while the city around them grew richer, taller, and more confident. Cook County Hospital stood at the point where that confidence met its consequences. Industrial accidents, infectious disease, difficult births, and illnesses left untreated because a family could not afford a private physician all passed through its doors. The old Gothic complex had once represented progress. Now its crowded wards belonged to a city that had already outgrown it. Cook County could have answered the problem with another plain institutional building. Instead, it chose grandeur. Between 1912 and 1914, a vast new hospital rose along Harrison Street on Chicago's near West Side. County architect Paul Gerhardt worked with Richard Schmidt, Garden, and Martin, a firm experienced in hospital design. The result was an 8-story structure whose long facade seemed less suited to a charity ward than to a courthouse, museum, or seat of government. The building cost approximately $3.5 million, an extraordinary public investment for its time. Gray granite anchored the lower floors. Yellow brick and pale terracotta covered the upper walls. 3-story Ionic columns framed the central entrance, while pediments, cartouches, lions, human faces, and small cherubic figures filled the facade with the formal vocabulary of the Beaux-Arts tradition. These details were not medically necessary. A carved lion could not lower a fever. A granite column could not stop bleeding, yet the architecture carried a message before any physician entered the room. The people coming here might have possessed very little, but the institution built to receive them would not be small. Inside, a high entrance hall and monumental staircase continued the effect. Corridors extended deep into the building, connecting examination rooms, wards, laboratories, teaching spaces, and surgical facilities. The hospital was planned as a machine for treating large numbers of people, but its public rooms were designed with the ceremony of a civic monument. For patients accustomed to factory gates, crowded lodging houses, and government offices where poverty was examined as a moral defect, the experience must have contained a strange contradiction. They entered because they could not pay, then found themselves beneath ceilings and columns associated with wealth and authority. The building did not erase the distinction between public charity and private medicine. Wealthier Chicagoans still had access to quieter hospitals, private rooms, and physicians chosen by family reputation. At County, patients entered a teaching institution organized around shared wards and relentless demand. Personal privacy was limited, and the daily rhythm belonged as much to the hospital as to the person in the bed. Even so, the new structure represented a significant promise. Cook County was declaring that care for the poor was not merely an act of emergency relief. It was a permanent public responsibility, deserving of specialized rooms, modern equipment, trained staff, and one of the most imposing buildings the county had ever commissioned. The first great population to fill those wards came from Europe. Russian Jews, Poles, Italians, Bohemians, and other newcomers arrived in Chicago during the decades surrounding the hospital's construction. Many found work in industries where injury was common and wages offered little protection against illness. English might be unfamiliar, family support could be distant, private hospitals could be too expensive or unwilling to accept them. Cook County became known as Chicago's Ellis Island, not because it decided who could enter the country, but because it received so many people after arrival had failed to provide security. The hospital encountered immigration through damaged hands, infected lungs, premature births, and diseases made worse by crowded housing. Its physicians saw the city not as civic leaders described it, but as laborers and their families experienced it. The comparison to Ellis Island contained another truth. People did not come to either institution because their lives were proceeding according to plan. They came because a larger system had placed their bodies under examination. As immigration from Europe slowed after the First World War, the population inside Cook County Hospital began to change. The Great Migration brought increasing numbers of African Americans from the South to Chicago, where industrial employment offered possibilities that segregation had denied them elsewhere. They arrived, however, in a city divided by restrictive housing practices, unequal employment, and discrimination within its medical institutions. Cook County admitted black patients in numbers that many private hospitals would not. Over time, its wards and maternity services became essential to Black Chicago. This did not mean the institution stood outside the racial order of the city. Access to treatment was not the same as equality within medicine. Black physicians and nurses faced barriers to training and appointment, even while black patients increasingly depended on the hospital's care. The building could therefore embody generosity and exclusion at once. Its main entrance was open more widely than many others, but not every professional doorway inside opened with it. That tension would become part of Cook County's identity. The hospital often served people because other institutions had refused to do so, then struggled under the weight of a responsibility the rest of the city had avoided. Its crowded wards were presented as proof that the public hospital was inefficient, although the crowd itself had been created by unequal access elsewhere. For the moment, however, the new complex still looked capable of carrying its burden. Additional wings expanded around the main building, and the hospital campus eventually grew toward 3,000 beds. Medical students came because few institutions offered such a range of injury and disease. Physicians could move from an unusual infection to an industrial amputation, then into a maternity ward or surgical theater within the same working day. This abundance of human need made Cook County one of the country's great teaching hospitals. It also introduced an ethical question that would never entirely leave the institution. The poor received treatment, but their illnesses also supplied the material from which other people built medical careers. Some doctors regarded county as a temporary ordeal before entering private practice. Others remained because they believed public medicine was the profession's clearest obligation. The building depended on both groups, as well as on nurses, orderlies, technicians, and attendants whose work rarely entered the official histories. Together they inhabited a structure designed to suggest permanence. Its walls implied that the county had solved the problem of caring for those who could not pay. In reality, it had only created a larger place in which the problem could gather. Yet inside that crowd palace, the concentration of patients, physicians, and urgent necessity would soon produce something more than strain. One doctor would look at the hospital's constant need for blood and reconsider an assumption medicine had accepted for generations. Cook County Hospital had learned how to receive life at its most vulnerable. It was about to learn how to store it. By the 1930s, Cook County Hospital had become one of the busiest medical institutions in Chicago, and blood was among its most difficult necessities. The hospital could perform increasingly ambitious operations, but a surgeon's skill meant little if a patient began to bleed faster than the staff could replace what was being lost. An injured laborer, a woman hemorrhaging after childbirth, or a child facing a dangerous procedure might all require a transfusion. The problem was not simply finding blood of the correct type, it was finding it in time. Before reliable storage became part of hospital practice, transfusion often depended on the presence of a living donor. Relatives could be tested. Volunteers might be called. In an emergency, staff members sometimes became the supply. The donor had to be located, examined, matched, and brought close enough to the patient for the procedure to begin. Cook County rarely had that luxury. Its patients arrived without warning, often alone, and frequently after illness or injury had already consumed the time medicine needed most. Bernard Fantus understood the weakness of that arrangement because he saw it repeatedly within the hospital. Fantus eventually became director of therapeutics at Cook County. His work concerned the practical details that determined whether treatment could be delivered at all. How medicines were prepared, how patients received them, and how a hospital could make essential therapies available before a crisis became fatal. Researchers had already learned that anticoagulants could prevent collected blood from clotting immediately, while refrigeration could extend the period during which it remained usable. Fantus did not invent every technique that made stored blood possible. His achievement was to gather those advances into a permanent service designed for the daily needs of a civilian hospital. On March 15, 1937, Cook County Hospital opened what became recognized as the first hospital blood bank in the United States. It began with approximately $1,500. The original name, Blood Preservation Laboratory, described the work accurately, but the service depended on public participation. Fantus chose a name that anyone could understand. A bank received deposits so that withdrawals could be made later. Blood would operate on the same principle. The hospital could not provide blood unless healthy people first gave it. Donors were examined and typed, and their blood was collected into sterile containers. The bottles were labeled and refrigerated so that the staff would no longer need to begin searching only after a patient was already in danger. Blood could now be waiting before the emergency arrived. Fantus and his colleagues found that properly collected blood could remain suitable for transfusion for as long as 10 days. By modern standards, that interval was brief. In 1937, it changed the meaning of preparedness. A hospital no longer had to treat every hemorrhage as an isolated race to find a donor. It could maintain a reserve and replenish the supply as part of its normal work. During the blood bank's first year, Cook County Hospital carried out 1,354 transfusions. Each represented a patient whose treatment no longer depended entirely on whether a compatible donor could be found at the correct hour. Stored blood made emergency operations more reliable, gave obstetricians another defense against maternal hemorrhage, and allowed surgeons to attempt procedures that would have been far more dangerous without a ready supply. The change was administrative as much as scientific. Blood had to be typed, tested, recorded, stored at a controlled temperature, and issued to the correct patient. A mistake could be lethal. The new department transformed something once arranged through urgent personal appeals into a disciplined system requiring technicians, records, refrigerators, and rules. Cook County was an appropriate place for such a system to take shape. It treated a large and unpredictable population, including people who arrived with little medical history. Its burden created the need, while its scale provided enough cases to prove that a permanent reserve of blood could become part of ordinary medicine rather than remain an unusual experiment. Fantous published an account of the program later in 1937, and the idea traveled quickly. Within several years, hospital and community blood banks began appearing across the United States. The name endured because it described more than a refrigerator filled with bottles. It described a civic agreement. Strangers could contribute something from their own bodies without knowing who would receive it, and the hospital would preserve that gift until another stranger needed it. That agreement became indispensable during the Second World War, when blood collection and plasma programs expanded far beyond anything Cook County had attempted. Other physicians and scientists, including Charles Drew, transformed blood collection and processing on a national scale. Fantous belonged to a larger history, but Cook County Hospital had given that history a durable institution and a name. Bernard Fantous died in 1940, 3 years after the blood bank opened. The hospital later placed his name on its outpatient clinic, but his more lasting memorial remained almost invisible. The expectation that blood should already be available when a patient begins to die. For Cook County, the achievement brought pride and a new kind of pressure. The hospital could now save people who might once have been lost before an operation began. More complicated surgery became possible, and more critically injured patients survived long enough to require further care. Medical progress did not reduce the work inside the building. It increased what the institution was expected to do. The Palace for those who could not pay had learned to store life in glass bottles and numbered refrigerators. Beyond its doors, Chicago was changing. Traffic thickened. Industry expanded, and new forms of violence began sending damaged bodies toward Harrison Street in greater numbers. Soon, Cook County would need more than a reserve of blood. It would need to reinvent the way a hospital received the wounded. The blood bank had given Cook County Hospital something it had never possessed before, a reserve against catastrophe. Blood could be collected before it was needed, stored behind a labeled door, and carried to an operating room when a life began to drain away. Yet the decades after the Second World War exposed a different weakness. The hospital could prepare the blood. It could not prepare for the number of wounded people who would arrive, or for the speed with which their injuries could become irreversible. Chicago had always been dangerous to the body. Its mills, rail yards, packing plants, construction sites, and factories had filled county's surgical wards for generations. After the war, automobiles added another source of injury on a scale that hospitals across the United States were only beginning to understand. Roads carried heavier traffic, while the system responsible for rescuing the injured remained divided among public agencies, private ambulance operators, and hospitals with widely different capabilities. An ambulance might bring a patient to the nearest emergency room rather than the one best equipped to treat the injury. The people inside the vehicle were often trained to transport, not to deliver advanced care. Hospitals could possess excellent surgeons and still lose a patient because no one had organized the journey from the street to the operating table. At Cook County, the consequences arrived through the receiving doors. A man crushed beneath industrial equipment did not need the same sequence of care as a patient with pneumonia. A driver with internal bleeding could appear conscious while his blood pressure was already falling. A gunshot wound might require a surgeon, blood, radiology, anesthesia, and an operating room within minutes, yet those resources belonged to separate departments with their own routines and chains of command. The building on Harrison Street had been designed during an earlier medical age. Its long wards suited prolonged illness, observation, and teaching rounds. But serious trauma demanded that every necessary resource converge on one patient immediately. The strength of the institution lay in the number of things it could do. Its weakness lay in how far apart those things remained. As the campus expanded, Cook County became a collection of buildings, additions, wards, and specialized departments accumulated over decades. A critically injured patient might need to be examined in one place, imaged in another, and moved again for surgery. Every transfer consumed time. Every handoff created another opportunity for information to be delayed or lost. For much of the 20th century, hospitals treated severe injury as an episode that interrupted ordinary work. A surgeon was summoned, a room was cleared, blood was requested. Nurses and residents assembled as circumstances required. The approach depended on talented individuals responding quickly, but it did not guarantee that the same preparation would exist at 3 a.m. as in the middle of the day. Cook County's workload made that uncertainty increasingly difficult to accept. The hospital served neighborhoods where private medical care was often inaccessible, and its emergency rooms received the human results of conditions that had begun far beyond the property line. Poor housing increased the risk of fire and childhood injury. Dangerous work placed laborers close to heavy machinery. Violence arrived as torn organs and shattered bone, but it had often begun years earlier in decisions about housing, employment, policing, and public spending. Inside the hospital, those histories were reduced to immediate clinical questions. Could the airway be kept open? Where was the bleeding? Was blood available? Could the patient reach an operating room in time? The word trauma described the wound, but not the entire cause. By the middle of the 1960s, the failure of emergency care had become impossible to dismiss as a local problem. A national study found that accidental injuries in 1965 had killed more than 100,000 Americans, permanently disabled hundreds of thousands, and temporarily disabled millions. The report described accidental death and disability as a neglected disease of modern society. Its argument was practical. Many people were not dying because their injuries were beyond treatment. They were dying because care was late, transportation was poorly organized, emergency departments were unevenly prepared, and specialists were not available when needed. The report called for better ambulances, stronger communication systems, trained personnel, and hospitals categorized according to what they could actually provide. It also proposed major trauma units where resuscitation, blood transfusion, laboratory testing, radiology, surgery, and intensive care could be brought together rather than requested one service at a time. Cook County Hospital did not need a national report to tell it that the existing arrangement was failing. Its staff had watched the same pattern repeat across thousands of patients. They had seen people survive the journey from a factory floor, an intersection, or a shooting, only to enter a hospital organized around departments rather than urgency. The injuries themselves were changing as well. More powerful firearms produced wounds that damaged several organs before a patient reached the door. Burns required specialized treatment and protection against infection. High-speed collisions created combinations of head, chest, abdominal, and skeletal injuries that no single specialist could manage alone. The old method asked which department should receive the patient. The better question was which people and resources should already be waiting. That change in perspective would alter Cook County Hospital more profoundly than any new surgical instrument. It required the institution to stop treating trauma as an interruption and begin treating it as a discipline. Surgeons, nurses, anesthesiologists, technicians, blood bank staff, and operating rooms would have to function as parts of one continuous system, beginning before the patient arrived and continuing through rehabilitation. The solution would not emerge from a new tower or a carefully funded construction program. Cook County had the need, the patience, and the physicians willing to reorganize the work. What it did not have was space. Then someone looked toward a dining room the hospital was no longer using. The room had been built for meals, not resuscitation. By 1966, the dining area inside Cook County Hospital was no longer being used for its original purpose. In an institution that had spent much of its history searching for space, an empty room was an invitation. Dr. Robert Freierk and Dr. Robert Baker saw more than spare floor area. They saw a place where the hospital could gather the people, equipment, and authority required to treat severe injury before precious minutes disappeared into corridors and telephone calls. What emerged there became the first comprehensive trauma unit of its kind in the United States. The distinction mattered. Cook County had treated injured patients for generations. Its surgeons knew how to repair damaged organs, control bleeding, and amputate limbs that could not be saved. The hospital possessed a blood bank, operating rooms, radiology services, laboratories, nurses, and physicians familiar with injuries rarely encountered in quieter institutions. What it lacked was a single system that brought those resources together. Freierk and Baker had studied trauma hospitals in Austria, where specialized centers had been placed near major roads to receive victims of automobile crashes. The European model drew partly upon methods developed in war, where large numbers of wounded people had forced military medicine to organize care around speed, sequence, and preparation. A casualty could not wait while a hospital decided who was responsible. The correct team had to be ready, and every person had to understand what came next. Cook County adapted that principle to a civilian city. The new unit was not merely another emergency room. It was designed to follow the seriously injured patient through an entire course of treatment. Resuscitation came first, followed by surgery and critical care. The unit also included beds for continued recovery, physical therapy, rehabilitation, and follow-up after discharge. Trauma was no longer treated as a single operation performed on the night of an accident. It was recognized as a condition that might shape the remainder of a patient's life. This was especially important at County, where many patients returned to homes, jobs, and neighborhoods that offered little assistance during recovery. Saving a factory worker from internal bleeding was only the beginning if he could no longer stand, lift, or walk well enough to earn a wage. A patient who survived a gunshot wound might still face infection, permanent disability, repeated operations, and months without income. The trauma unit acknowledged that survival had stages. Its most important innovation was not a new machine or surgical procedure. It was availability. A dedicated group of surgeons, nurses, and other medical personnel trained for critical injury remained prepared to respond at any hour. Instead of assembling a team after the patient arrived, the unit made the team part of the hospital's permanent structure. That change altered the first minutes of care. A person brought in after a collision or shooting could be evaluated by staff accustomed to recognizing shock before its outward signs became unmistakable. Blood could be requested quickly. An operating room belonged to the unit rather than having to be found elsewhere in the building. Decisions that had once traveled through several departments could be made close to the patient. The old Cook County building still imposed its limits. The trauma unit did not transform the entire hospital into a modern facility, and it could not remove the social conditions producing so many of the injuries it treated. Yet within a room left behind by an earlier arrangement, County created a smaller institution organized according to a different understanding of time. Elsewhere in the hospital, Time could be measured in rounds, laboratory schedules, visiting hours, and days of observation. In trauma, it was measured in falling blood pressure, interrupted breathing, and the distance between a wounded organ and an operating table. The unit's patients came from across Chicago and beyond. Automobile crashes supplied a growing number. Industrial accidents continued to damage hands, spines, and limbs. Falls, burns, stabbings, and gunshots arrived without regard for the hospital's staffing difficulties or political disputes. Newer firearms produced wounds of greater complexity, tearing through several organs and leaving surgeons to control multiple sources of bleeding at once. Cook County became a place where the city's violence was translated into anatomy. A shooting reported in a few lines of newsprint might occupy an operating room for hours. A collision that blocked traffic briefly could leave a patient in rehabilitation for months. The trauma unit encountered these events after their public drama had ended, when what remained was damaged tissue and the quieter work of deciding what could still be saved. Because the unit treated so many cases, it also created knowledge. Physicians could compare methods, study patterns of shock, and refine the order in which injuries were assessed. Nurses developed experience that could not be acquired from textbooks alone. The number of patients was itself a form of instruction, although the hospital's learning continued to depend on people who had entered the building during the worst moments of their lives. By the 1970s, other hospitals were studying the Cook County model. The principle that severe injury required a designated center, a trained team, and coordinated care began to spread. Under the leadership of physicians including Dr. John Barrett, Cook County also helped shape local and statewide emergency medical services, extending the logic of the trauma unit beyond the hospital walls. This was a necessary development because trauma care could not begin only after a patient reached Harrison Street. Ambulance personnel needed training, dispatchers needed reliable communication. Hospitals needed to know what kind of injury was coming and whether they possessed the resources to treat it. The journey from the street to the surgical table had to become a continuous chain rather than a series of unrelated decisions. The dining room had changed the interior of the hospital. The emergency medical system changed the territory around it. Cook County's achievement was therefore larger than the room where it began. The hospital had demonstrated that survival from severe injury depended not only on the talent of an individual surgeon, but on the design of an institution. Preparation could be built, responsibility could be assigned in advance. The arrival of a wounded patient did not have to create the system needed to save him. That system could already be waiting. But success created another burden. As Cook County became known for treating injuries that other hospitals could not manage, more patients were sent toward its doors. The trauma unit saved lives, trained specialists, and influenced emergency care far beyond Chicago. It also became another reason the aging public hospital was expected to absorb a responsibility larger than its budget and older than its walls. The abandoned dining room had offered a solution to one medical problem. It could not protect the hospital from the politics surrounding it. By the 1970s, Cook County Hospital had proved that it could change medicine. It had created a blood bank, organized trauma care, and trained generations of physicians in diseases and injuries that many private hospitals seldom encountered. Yet none of those achievements protected the institution from the system that governed it. The hospital could prepare for hemorrhage and shock. It had no comparable defense against appointments, dismissals, budget decisions, and political authority exercised far from a patient's bed. In 1969, the Illinois legislature created the Health and Hospitals Governing Commission of Cook County. It was intended to coordinate the county's hospitals and clinics and bring professional management to a sprawling public system. On paper, it offered distance from the old habits of patronage. In practice, authority remained contested. Physicians answered to administrators answered to public officials, and every major expenditure could become a struggle over what the poor were entitled to receive. That struggle reached the wards in 1975. The controversial dismissal of physicians helped ignite a confrontation between the governing commission and the hospital's house staff. More than 600 interns and residents walked out on October 27. The strike continued for 18 days, one of the longest actions by physicians in United States history. The young doctors were not demanding only higher salaries or shorter hours. Their list included equipment and services that a functioning hospital should not have needed a strike to obtain: electrocardiogram machines, interpreters for Spanish-speaking patients, dependable laboratory and X-ray services, medicine, and basic supplies. Contemporary accounts described rooms holding dozens of patients without curtains between their beds. The dispute concerned employment, but it also concerned the conditions under which county's patients were expected to be sick. A doctor's strike carried an unavoidable moral burden. The people placed at risk were patients who had already reached the end of their alternatives. Yet the residents argued that continuing to work silently inside an unsafe system also carried a cost. By improvising, borrowing equipment, and accepting impossible workloads, they concealed failures that officials could then postpone correcting. The strike ended, and the conflict contributed to the eventual collapse of the governing commission. It did not produce a new hospital. The old building remained, along with overloaded clinics, deteriorating infrastructure, and an uncertain supply of modern equipment. Within a few years, Cook County had lost accreditation, while proposals to close or replace it circulated, and Chicago continued to send patients through its doors. This was the institution David Ansel chose in 1978. Ansel had studied medicine in upstate New York with classmates shaped by the civil rights and anti-war movements. They wanted to train where medicine could not be separated from poverty, race, and political power. Their professors warned them against Cook County. Its national reputation had faded, its building had been considered obsolete for decades, and the recent strike had made its instability impossible to ignore. 5 members of the group listed county as their only choice for residency. Quentin Young, chairman of medicine, offered a reason to believe the hospital was still worth entering. Young had worked in the civil rights movement and regarded health care as a public obligation rather than a commodity. To him, county's disorder showed what happened when a public institution received enormous responsibility without the stable support required to carry it. In Ansel's later account, new residents often learned through a harsh form of independence. Supervision could be limited, attending physicians were not always close at hand, and the volume of illness left little time for reflection. Young doctors depended on one another, passing knowledge across night shifts and making decisions that senior staff would have handled in better supported hospitals. The experience produced capable physicians because it exposed them to almost everything. It could also produce incomplete care because the patient served as the ground on which that education occurred. Counties' waiting areas filled with people who had postponed treatment until pain, weakness, or fear made further delay impossible. Routine supplies could be difficult to locate. Specialized tests could require long waits. The building that had once announced the dignity of public medicine now asked patients to surrender privacy, time, and comfort before treatment even began. Some doctors endured county as a stage in their training and left when they could. Others stayed because the conditions offended them and because leaving would place the burden on whoever remained. Ansel became one of those physicians. What began as residency became 17 years at county, first as a trainee and later as an attending physician and division chief. His decision did not make him the hospital's rescuer. County was too large, and its failures were too deeply connected to the city around it for any individual to repair. His importance lies in what he witnessed. He watched the same institution perform excellent medicine and deny basic dignity, sometimes within a few doors of each other. He saw nurses and doctors compensate for shortages through skill and loyalty, then saw that loyalty used as evidence that the shortages were tolerable. This was the central bargain at Cook County. Dedicated people repeatedly prevented the hospital from collapsing, while their success allowed public officials to postpone decisions that might have made such devotion less necessary. Politics at County did not exist only in elections or commission meetings. It appeared in the number of nurses assigned to a ward, the months a woman waited for a diagnostic procedure, the language available at a bedside, and the difference between equipment approved in a budget and equipment present when a patient needed it. Every delay had an administrative history. By the early 1980s, Ansel and his colleagues began noticing another pattern. Patients were arriving from private hospitals with transfer papers, unfinished treatment, and no convincing medical reason for being moved. What they often lacked was insurance. Cook County had always accepted the people other institutions would not. Now its physicians began to document how deliberately those people were being sent there. A transfer between hospitals is supposed to mean that one institution has reached the limit of what it can provide. A patient may require a specialist, a piece of equipment, or a level of care available somewhere else. The decision should begin with medicine. During the early 1980s, physicians at Cook County Hospital began to suspect that many transfers arriving at their doors had begun with a different calculation. The patients were not necessarily being sent because County possessed a treatment unavailable at the first hospital. Some had already entered private emergency departments capable of evaluating them. They were examined, identified as seriously ill, and then moved across Chicago while their conditions remained unresolved. What many of them shared was not a diagnosis. It was the absence of adequate insurance. For Cook County, this practice was not entirely new. Public hospitals had long received people whom private institutions were reluctant to treat. Yet the growth of insurance-based medicine gave the old exclusion a modern procedure. A patient could be registered, assessed, placed in an ambulance, and transferred under the language of administrative necessity. The movement appeared orderly. The financial decision behind it remained largely hidden. David Ansel and several colleagues wanted evidence that could not be dismissed as complaint or memory. Led by physician Robert Schiff, they began a prospective study of patients transferred from emergency departments throughout the Chicago area to Cook County and subsequently admitted. They followed 467 medical and surgical patients. The figures revealed a pattern more precise than any individual story. 89% of the transferred patients were Black or Hispanic, 81% were unemployed. In 87% of the cases, the reason given for transfer was that the patient lacked adequate medical insurance. Only 6% had provided written consent. The patients were not being moved after every immediate danger had passed. Nearly 1/4 had been clinically unstable at the hospital sending them away. 22% required intensive care, usually within the first day after reaching County. Among transferred patients admitted to the medical service, the death rate was 9.4%. For medical patients who had not been transferred, it was 3.8%. The study did not claim that every death had been caused by the journey. These were sick people, and the circumstances of their illnesses differed. But the findings showed that hospitals were moving seriously ill patients for economic reasons, and that many were arriving at Cook County in conditions that made delay dangerous. The practice acquired a name: patient dumping. The phrase was blunt, but the process itself rarely looked crude. There did not have to be an argument at the emergency room entrance. No administrator had to announce that an uninsured life was worth less. The exclusion could be accomplished through forms, telephone calls, transfer agreements, and an ambulance destination entered into a record. The patient was not officially denied care. The patient was sent somewhere else. Cook County absorbed the consequences, its beds filled with people whose treatment had already been interrupted. Its intensive care units received patients who might have remained at the first hospital if their insurance cards had been different. The public institution was then judged for its overcrowding and expense, although part of that burden had been transferred to it by hospitals protecting their own finances. The county physicians published their findings in the New England Journal of Medicine in February 1986. Their work was not the only evidence of patient dumping in the United States, and the federal response did not arise from Cook County alone. Similar reports were appearing in other cities, while lawmakers were hearing that emergency departments were refusing or transferring people because they could not pay. Later that year, Congress enacted the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. The law did not create universal health care. It did not guarantee that every illness would be treated without cost, and it did not provide hospitals with the money required to care for every uninsured patient. Its protection was narrower but fundamental. Hospitals participating in Medicare and operating emergency departments were required to provide an appropriate medical screening examination to anyone requesting emergency care, regardless of the person's ability to pay. When an emergency medical condition was found, the hospital had to provide stabilizing treatment or arrange an appropriate transfer when care exceeded its capabilities. A hospital could still transfer a patient. It could no longer make the patient's empty wallet the medical reason. The distinction changed emergency medicine across the country. Before the law, professional standards against discriminatory treatment existed, but their enforcement was weak and uneven. Afterward, the obligation to screen and stabilize was tied to federal law and the hospital's participation in Medicare. It was an imperfect protection. Disputes over what counted as an adequate examination, a stable condition, or an appropriate transfer would continue for decades. The law also placed a major duty on emergency departments without solving the larger absence of affordable medical care. Patients who could not obtain routine treatment still entered hospitals after preventable conditions became emergencies. Even so, something that Cook County's physicians had documented within their own crowded wards had crossed the property line. The hospital had done more than receive the rejected patients. It had converted their experience into evidence, and that evidence helped define a right recognized in emergency rooms throughout the United States. The same decade brought another test of who would be received. In 1982, Cook County opened Chicago's first clinic dedicated to patients with HIV. As the number of infections increased and AIDS remained surrounded by fear, stigma, and limited medical knowledge, the hospital expanded its services. By the following year, it had established one of the nation's early AIDS wards. In 1987, Cook County's Public Health Department reported a substantial increase in AIDS-related work, and the hospital later held a quilt memorial service for patients who had died. Once again, the public hospital became the place where a disease entered civic responsibility after much of society had treated its patients as people to avoid. In 1986, Agnes Latimer became Cook County Hospital's medical director. Decades earlier, as a medical student rotating between a private hospital and county, she had watched the same physician treat affluent and poor women with markedly different degrees of respect. She had resolved that if she ever gained authority, she would challenge the patronizing attitudes directed toward public patients. Her appointment made her the first African American woman to direct a major hospital in the United States. She introduced what she called a philosophy of caring, insisting that medical competence could not be separated from compassion. At Cook County, this was not a decorative principle. It confronted a habit older than the building itself, the belief that people receiving public care should also accept public humiliation. By the end of the decade, County had helped expose patient dumping, established care for a new epidemic, and placed a black woman in command of an institution that had once restricted professional opportunities while depending heavily on black patients. The hospital remained overcrowded. Its corridors had not grown wider, and its political troubles had not disappeared. But the people inside had learned how to make the institution's burden visible beyond its walls. Soon, millions of Americans would encounter a Chicago County hospital every week on television. They would see the trauma, the exhaustion, and the crowded emergency room. What they would not always see was why so many patients had nowhere else to go. By the early 1990s, Cook County Hospital had spent more than a century receiving the people Chicago could not place anywhere else. Its emergency rooms had become crowded records of the city's unfinished business. Industrial injuries, gun violence, untreated illness, addiction, psychiatric crisis, and the consequences of being poor in a medical system organized around payment. Then, in September 1994, millions of Americans began entering a Chicago public hospital every Thursday night. The hospital was called County General. It did not exist. ER opened without the reassuring order that television medicine had traditionally offered. Doctors spoke in language the audience was not expected to understand immediately. Nurses moved through the frame carrying information that might become important several minutes later. One patient arrived before the previous crisis had ended, and the camera followed the staff through corridors where private grief unfolded in public. The effect felt familiar to anyone who had worked at Cook County. Yet the relationship between the real hospital and the television series requires care. Michael Crichton did not write R as a direct account of Cook County Hospital. He first produced the script in 1974, drawing upon his own experiences as a medical student in a busy emergency room. For nearly 20 years, producers considered the material too technical, too fast, or too difficult to shape into conventional drama. Crichton resisted many of the changes they wanted. Real emergency medicine did not pause so that every term could be explained, and patients did not arrange their illnesses into complete stories with satisfying conclusions. His script preserved that disorder. When the project finally reached television, Steven Spielberg and producer John Wells recognized that the very qualities once considered weaknesses could make the series distinct. The fictional hospital was placed in Chicago and named County General, a title close enough to Cook County to suggest a public institution without claiming to represent one specific building. County General was therefore a composite. Its original stories came from Crichton's medical training. Its physical interiors were created in California, beginning with an abandoned Los Angeles hospital used for the pilot. Its camera style developed partly from practical necessity. The corridors were too confined for conventional equipment, so director Rod Holcomb and his crew used long, moving shots that allowed physicians, nurses, patients, and orderlies to enter and leave the same frame. The camera rarely seemed to stand outside the work and observe it calmly. It moved with the staff because the staff could not stop. That visual language became one of the series' defining features. A physician might deliver a diagnosis while crossing the emergency room, sign an order at a desk, answer a question from a nurse, and turn toward an arriving ambulance without the scene cutting away. Background activity continued even when the principal characters were occupied elsewhere. County General appeared to possess a life independent of the people whose names appeared in the credits. This was where the fictional hospital most closely resembled Cook County. At a large public institution, no single physician could contain the entire story. A surgeon might remember the operation that saved a patient while a nurse remembered the hours before it, when no bed was available. A resident might recall an unusual diagnosis while the patient remembered waiting in pain beneath fluorescent lights. The institution joined those experiences without allowing any one person to see them all. Understood that a hospital was not merely a collection of rooms. It was a system of interruptions. The production worked carefully to preserve medical credibility. Advisors trained the actors in procedures, terminology, and the physical habits of hospital work. Performers practiced suturing and learned to speak long passages of technical dialogue while moving through crowded sets. Writers and producers observed real emergency departments, and the show employed physicians who could challenge scenes that departed too far from medical practice. The accuracy was never complete. Television compressed hours into minutes, combined medical events, and gave recurring characters a degree of involvement that ordinary hospital staffing would rarely permit. A trauma case that might require prolonged surgery, intensive care, rehabilitation, and months of follow-up could be reduced to a few sequences before the story moved elsewhere. But ER often preserved a deeper truth about emergency medicine. The work continued before anyone was emotionally ready. A physician could pronounce one patient dead and immediately be called to another room. A nurse could comfort a family, clean the space, and prepare it for the next arrival. The institution did not provide time for every loss to become a private ceremony. Grief had to coexist with procedure. Cook County had operated according to that rhythm long before television discovered it. The resemblance extended beyond pace. County General served patients with no private physician, no reliable insurance, and no safe place to recover. Its staff confronted violence, AIDS, addiction, child abuse, homelessness, and racial inequality. These subjects were not presented as interruptions to the hospital's medical mission. They were part of the medicine because they shaped who became ill, how long treatment had been delayed, and what happened after discharge. For viewers, the series made the public emergency room a weekly national institution. People who had never entered Cook County Hospital became familiar with overcrowded waiting areas, exhausted residents, strained nurses, and the uneasy border between extraordinary skill and institutional failure. Yet television also imposed limits on what could be seen. County General could show an uninsured patient during a single episode. Cook County had to treat that patient and thousands of others year after year. A fictional administrator could be exposed, transferred, or redeemed as a season progressed. The real hospital remained tied to elected officials, budgets, labor disputes, and policies whose consequences accumulated slowly. On television, a difficult case often ended when the patient left the room. At County, the same patient might return because the underlying illness, unsafe housing, or lack of ordinary medical care had never changed. R captured the visible emergency. Cook County lived with its source. The series continued for 15 seasons, long enough for its young doctors to age, leave, and be replaced. County General appeared permanent, even as nearly every familiar face disappeared. That, too, reflected the experience of the real building on Harrison Street. Generations of interns had entered its wards, learned medicine from its patients, and departed for other hospitals. Nurses retired, administrators changed, political promises arrived and expired. The structure remained, absorbing each new group into routines older than any of them. But while County General was becoming one of the most recognizable hospitals in American culture, Cook County's palace was nearing the end of its medical life. Its systems had been repaired, adapted, and extended beyond what its original designers could have imagined. The institution it housed was still necessary. The building itself was running out of time. By the time County General became familiar to television audiences, the real Cook County Hospital had already entered a prolonged argument over whether its building could continue to serve the medicine practiced inside it. The question was not whether Chicago still needed a public hospital. Its emergency department, trauma service, clinics, and specialty wards remained essential to patients who were uninsured, underinsured, or unable to find care elsewhere. The problem was the physical structure that had carried that responsibility since the early 20th century. Medicine had changed around it. Intensive care required larger concentrations of equipment. Modern operating rooms needed complex ventilation and electrical systems. Diagnostic machines occupied spaces their original architects could not have anticipated. Patient privacy, infection control, and accessibility were no longer secondary considerations. They were part of competent care. Cook County had adapted whenever it could. Walls were moved, rooms were reassigned, utilities were extended, and departments were placed wherever space became available. Each alteration allowed the hospital to continue a little longer, but it also added another layer to a building whose internal logic had been written for another age. The palace had become a maze. For decades, proposals to replace it met the same resistance that had shaped the hospital's earlier history. A new facility would cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and opponents questioned whether county government should make such an investment. Some believed the existing structure could be repaired again. Others argued that public medicine itself should be reduced, transferred, or divided among smaller institutions. The debate concerned architecture and finance, but beneath both was an older question. How much was Cook County prepared to spend on people who could not pay for their own treatment? In 1994, the Cook County Board of Commissioners held public hearings on the need for a replacement hospital. The decision was controversial, particularly at a time when public hospitals elsewhere were closing or being sold, yet the argument for replacement eventually prevailed. In 1998, construction began on a new hospital immediately south of the old building. The project cost approximately $551 million. It contained fewer beds than the immense hospital complex County had once operated, reflecting a medical system that increasingly relied on outpatient treatment and shorter hospital stays. What it offered was something the Harrison Street building could no longer provide through another renovation, a facility designed around contemporary medicine rather than adapted to it. The new hospital was named for John H. Stroger, Jr., the president of the Cook County Board, who had become one of its strongest political defenders. The naming was significant. Cook County Hospital had always been inseparable from politics, and its replacement would carry the name of the official who had survived the political struggle required to build it. On December 12, 2002, 320 patients were transferred from the old hospital into the new John H. Stroger Jr. Hospital of Cook County. The medical institution did not disappear. Its trauma teams, clinics, physicians, nurses, and public obligations crossed into a building nearby. The original hospital closed. For nearly 90 years, its doors had admitted patients who arrived by ambulance, streetcar, automobile, police vehicle, and on foot. Children had been born inside its wards. Blood had been stored there before most Americans understood what a blood bank was. Surgeons had organized trauma care in a dining room because no proper space existed. Physicians had documented the transfer of uninsured patients and helped expose a practice that altered federal emergency law. Now the rooms were emptying. The departure did not produce an immediate plan for what would follow. Cook County initially intended to demolish the old structure. The hospital was large, contaminated with asbestos, damaged by decades of institutional use, and costly to maintain. Several wings and connecting structures on the south side were eventually torn down in 2005. The main administration building remained, but survival was not yet preservation. Rain entered through failing sections of the roof. Windows broke. Water and temperature changes damaged plaster, flooring, and ornamental surfaces. Copper and other materials were stripped away. Corridors once crowded with patients stood exposed to weather and vandalism. The monumental facade still faced Harrison Street, concealing an interior that deteriorated further each year. To county officials considering the cost of stabilization, demolition could appear practical. To preservationists, destroying the building would remove the physical record of an institution whose influence extended far beyond Chicago. Landmarks Illinois placed Cook County Hospital on its list of the state's most endangered historic places repeatedly between 2001 and 2005. Preservation Chicago and the National Trust for Historic Preservation also drew attention to the threat. Advocates produced reuse studies, met with county commissioners, and argued that the steel-framed structure remained sound enough to support another life. Their case was not that every old hospital room should be frozen in place. The building had already changed repeatedly during its medical years, and much of its original interior had been lost. The argument was that adaptation had always been part of Cook County Hospital's history. The institution had turned poorhouse beds into medical wards, a dining room into a trauma unit, and public neglect into national reform. The building might also be changed without being erased. In 2006, the administration building was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Even then, redevelopment remained uncertain. It would take another decade of proposals, negotiations, and public planning before Cook County selected a private development team. Restoration began in 2018, 16 years after the last patients had left. The work revealed how much the building had endured. More than 4,500 damaged pieces of terracotta had to be replaced on the exterior. The main lobby was restored to its original height, along with surviving terrazzo floors, decorative molding, and barrel-vaulted corridors. The rehabilitation cost approximately $140 million. By 2020, the former hospital had begun a new existence. Its upper floors contained 2 hotels with a combined 210 rooms. Other sections became medical offices, retail space, a food hall, and community facilities. Some former operating spaces were preserved or adapted, while the exterior once again displayed the architectural confidence with which the county had built its palace for the poor. The transformation saved the building, but it also changed the meaning of its open doors. A guest entering today may sleep in a room where hospital work once took place. Visitors can eat beneath a name associated with Chicago medicine and walk through restored spaces that no longer carry the sounds of crowded wards. The same architecture that once promised dignity to people unable to pay now serves a development shaped partly by hospitality and commerce. This is not a simple betrayal. Demolition would have removed the building entirely, along with its craftsmanship and physical connection to generations of patients and workers. The restoration preserved a rare public monument and returned activity to a structure that had stood vacant for almost 2 decades. But preservation is not the same as continuation. The old Cook County Hospital survived because it ceased to be a hospital. The public mission moved into the Stroger building next door, where the work continued without the columns, carved lions, and long Beaux-Arts facade that had once made charity look like civic honor. That separation leaves the final meaning of Cook County unresolved. Its history proves that neglected institutions can produce extraordinary medicine, but it does not prove that neglect was necessary. The blood bank, the trauma unit, and the campaign against patient dumping emerged from people who refused to accept the limitations around them. Their achievements should not excuse the conditions they were forced to overcome. Cook County Hospital was born from the belief that poverty should not close the door to medical care. Across nearly 2 centuries, that belief was expanded, compromised, defended, and repeatedly tested. The institution saved lives while exposing how easily a society could divide patients by class, race, and insurance status. The building still stands on Harrison Street. Its stone entrance remains broad enough for the crowds that once passed beneath it, and the hospital name remains visible above doors that now lead somewhere else. The palace survived. The question it raised did not. Who receives care when care becomes expensive, and what kind of building is a society willing to construct for people who cannot pay?